Hi, this is Dr. Sana Hashmi. I'm a fellow at Taiwan Asia Exchange Foundation. And this week in my Prince Eye on China column, I talked about the Chinese responses to the ousting of Syrian President Bashar al Assad. He was often described as a friend of China in the Middle Eastern region. And in this context, the piece is primarily talking about how China is navigating the fallout of Assad regime, and that is a significant development that has potential ripple effects across the Middle Eastern region. And given China has substantial interest in the region, specifically, we have seen how it brokered a deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And also, there were talks about how China could perhaps be a peace broker in the Israel Hamas conflict as well. Of course, this didn't happen, but there has been discussions about how China could play a more proactive, more meaningful role in the Middle Eastern region. So now coming back to the ousting of Assad, has been a long-time ally of Beijing, was pivotal to China's regional strategy, particularly in the context of Belt and Road Initiative as well as China's standing in the region. So, in fact, last year his high-profile visit to China underscored this bond between China as well as Syria as well. However, with Assad removal, China does face a fresh challenge in a region that has already been shaken by the ongoing Israel Hamas conflict. So there is a lot of instability within the region. So, absolutely, China's interest in the region are at stakes. So let's break this down. How is it? What are the Chinese responses, and how it is going to impact China, and what is China going to do now that Assad is not there anymore, and now there is a new government in Syria? And in fact, of course, now there are a lot of scholars, media talking about Syria because this is a development that has come as a surprise. No one, after over 5 decades of Assad family dynastic rule in Syria, this is a new development in the region. So, of course, a lot of countries do not really know how to deal with it. And but before that, there has not been a lot of discussion about China and Syria relation, and but Syria was an important component of China's Middle Eastern strategy, and China has been doing a lot in Syria that we didn't really talk about before. So now Chinese analysts like Cao Wan-ing, he highlighted how internal political changes in Syria might disrupt the broader regional dynamics. Then, as I've already mentioned, that Assad, who was seen as a pro China leader in the region, had been critical to Beijing's vision for the new Silk Road as well as a railway connecting China to Europe via Syria. So, of all the countries within the region, be it Russia, be it Turkey or Iran, perhaps, of all these countries, Syria was considered more trustworthy towards China. That's one of the reasons why there were talks of Syria being an important link for this China Europe rail. So the strategic alignment is now in jeopardy, especially with the potential disruption of Chinese key infrastructure projects, and there have always been controversy surrounding the Belt and Road Initiative. So, of course, when Assad is not in Syria, how this is going to impact the Belt and Road Initiative and Chinese infrastructure projects in the region is definitely a cause of concern for the Chinese. So now the removal of Assad also raises security concerns. It's just not about economic and infrastructure concerns. So Chinese experts like Chin Tian warn of a security vacuum that could perhaps lead to further terrorism and refugee outflows. And that does threaten Chinese investments and Chinese citizens as well as assets in the region. And there's also this issue of rising Islamist extremism, which could profoundly impact China. As of now, there might be indirect challenges. There are not no direct challenges towards China, but it does have impact and it might impact China further in times to come. And particularly perhaps through what China refers to as the Uyghur militant groups. And there is this fear that the refugees, the so called militant groups, might get more power to work against the Chinese assets and citizens in the Middle Eastern region. But despite these challenges, Chinese discourse also suggests that the economic fallout for China may be minimal. So, of course, let's talk about statistics here. So, trade volume and investment in Syria are relatively modest, specifically if we compare Chinese trade two-way trade figures with other countries and investment is actually not a lot in comparison. However, it's clear that China does prioritize long term stability in the region, that, according to the Chinese discourse, it contrasts sharply with what it perceives as the US opportunistic approach to regional chaos. So, of course, over the decades, we have seen how the color revolutions in the Central Asian region and the Middle Eastern region have been kind of seen as something that has been driven by the West and particularly the US. So, in fact, there has also been discussion about how this could be seen as a color revolution in Syria that has been instigated by the US. So of course there's this comparison that how US is a disruptor and how China is a responsible stakeholder. China does not really interfere in countries' internal affairs, whereas the US has been creating this instability in the region that is not even in its vicinity. So I think China does have constraint in the region. China's influence has been limited in Syria as well. And this is what is shaping its cautious strategy as of now. Even if we look at the statement that has come out of the Ministry of External Affairs, that's very measured and very neutral. Uh, they have said that they believe regional stability will come back, and they should respect the mandate, the people, the whatever the Syrian people want, and of course the future of Syria should be decided by them. So, unlike other major powers, Beijing avoids direct intervention. And it is focusing instead on peace building, at least this is what they have been saying, and reconstruction efforts. And this non intervention in Syria as well is there primarily because of three reasons. So, the first reason is that Syria is, of course, not China's immediate neighbor. And true, there might be spillover effects that I've already talked about that would impact China indirectly and that would impact the regional security. But this is not China's immediate concern as of now, and this definitely limits possibility of China's intervention in Syria or in the broader region. Then, second, it has really not been China's policy to intervene in other countries' affairs, and not at least militarily. Perhaps we could see some diplomatic initiatives later, but only when it is when it becomes a regional issue, when we see there is a regional instability or lack of security. So that brings me to my third reason, and that is no matter how unfavorable this outcome has been for China, Beijing still views this as an internal issue and an outcome of a decades long civil war in Syria. So this in this situation, China foresees its role only as a country that perhaps could help Syria rebuild itself, um, so that it could perhaps project itself as a responsible rising power. So it directly presents China in contrast to what the US has been doing. So, there has been a lot of talk about how China is a responsible power, how China believes in peace building, how China believes in reconstruction of countries that have been torn by civil war. So, this is what primarily the discussion about China as a responsible stakeholder in the region has been there within the Chinese discourse. So, therefore, Chinese analysts argue that while the West erroneously overestimate China's role in the Middle East, Beijing prefers a pragmatic approach that involves carefully weighing risk and benefits before committing to a significant action. So, in this situation, what is next for China in Syria? So, with Assad now exiled in Moscow and Syria in turmoil, and there is he has also perhaps taken retirement from politics. So now Beijing is more inclined to observe and adapt. It's more like a wait and see approach. So while the situation in Syria and the Middle East remain fluid, one thing is certain, at least on the Chinese part, that China's long term interest in the region are very much there. But for now, the interest and China's approach is going to be focused on reconstruction and perhaps economic partnership, or reaching out to the new government in Syria and to see how its interest in the region could be preserved. So China will keep the new government engaged, but of course there will be some cautious approach when it comes to China uh, engagement with Syria or perhaps the entire Middle Eastern region. So perhaps to end, I could say that it is wait and watch approach, and there would be a cautious diplomacy from the Chinese side as well. So thank you for watching Prince Eye on China column today. I'll see you next week. Thank you.